You're on, brother.
I don't mind bagels for a snack.
Quit panning around the room.
That's when they're served at work.
All right. Order in the court. We're talking about law today.
Oh, preach it.
So, clearly this is an unorthodox facility, and we do a lot of unorthodox things here, according to what normal religion tells us we should or should not do. I mean, eating before service is kind of faux pas. I'm really excited that we're doing that. And that really plays very much in line with what I believe the Lord has put in my heart to share with you all for the next couple of weeks. And that is who we are in Christ and who we believe that Christ is and what he fulfilled and finished for us, so that the identity that we can walk in rubs very much against conventional religion. And it did in the early church, in which we're going to be unpacking, and it does today. And as you guys have heard me over the last couple of years kind of chiming in, throwing scriptures around, and if there's anything that I can instill and what to look forward to in the next few weeks, is really unpacking this identity that we believe. What was so rare and so beautiful about this place was this faith in righteousness, and this belief in righteousness and holiness and who we are and what Christ did. And the first time I showed up here a couple of years ago, Ted was teaching on Romans chapter 6, which is awesome. And from that point, I've heard so much New Testament scriptures from the various teachers, and it's come up in many other churches and books that we have outside. But there's an amazing stories. There's many, many stories that have been laid out for us in the first covenant that point to this story, to this identity. And Stephen, in Acts chapter 7, lays a chronological order of events in defending the Christ. So let's get started with some reading. We're not going to read the whole chapter. We're just going to unpack one character and one group of stories at a time. So I'm going to, if someone who can read Acts chapter 7 from verse 1 through verse 8. Okay, so you read that, and I'm just going to start off. I'm in the NASB, but whatever righteous version you have, by all means use it. So I'm going to read a little bit in 6, starting in verse 8, and then Mr. Zimmer is going to pick up from verse 1 of chapter 7 through verse 8. So chapter 6, there's a dissension that raises up in the early church. Who's going to feed the widows? And they pick seven men, and the seventh is Stephen, a man full of spirit and wisdom. And this is now in verse 8. And Stephen, full of grace and power, performing great wonders and signs among the people. But some men who were called the synagogue of the freedmen, including the Cyrenians, the Alexandrians, some from Cilicia, and Asia, rose up and argued with Stephen. But they were unable to cope with the wisdom and the spirit by which he was speaking. Then they secretly induced men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God." And they stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes, and they came up, dragging him away, and brought him before the council. And they put forward false witnesses who said, "This man insistently speaks against the holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Nazarene, Jesus, will destroy this place and the altar and the customs by which Moses handed down to us." And fixing their gaze on him, all were sitting at the council, saw his face like the face of an angel.
Then the high priest said, "Are these things so?" And he said, "Brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, 'Get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you.' Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which he now dwelt. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on it. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession, and to his descendants after him. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God. And after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. Then he gave them the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham begot Isaac, and circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs.
Okay. So now there is a lot of stuff. So, I mean, Abraham, there's 8 chapters in the book of Genesis, and not only that, but you have the story of Abraham scattered throughout the entire Bible. And in one paragraph, Stephen just sums it all up in one paragraph, the entire life of Abraham. So now we can spend the next few months just going through the life of Abraham. So the intent of this is just to, again, be a high-level overview of these stories and why they're so important. Because this testimony that you all bear of righteousness, as we've discussed and as you probably know, rubs up against religion. Because the Pharisaical and Sadduceical religion of today will tell you that you are still a sinner, you are still under the condemnation of sin, inherently, not directly, under the law, try harder, do better, and all the things that we've talked about here for so long. Why is this story so important? And why should we use the testimony of Abraham in reaffirming and defending our identity and our faith? So let's go look real quickly at some of the keynote stories in Abraham's life. So everybody turn to Genesis. Chapter 12, namely. So the intent of today, we're going to read through a bunch of different scriptures, and then we'll start connecting some of the dots. And by all means, if you have a pressing question that you feel that needs to be answered, by all means, say, hey, I've got a question, and it's all good. If you feel it's a question should be tabled at the end, write it down. You got some paper on the table, and write it down. And by all means, if there's a scripture or a scriptural story that bears witness to what we're teaching, by all means, bring those forward as well. So in chapter 12, verse 1, and now the Lord said to Abram, and if you have a written Bible and have a writing utensil, circle Abram. So that's important. If we're talking about Abram or if we're talking about Abraham. They're not to be confused, because if they were the same identity, then God would have kept his name Abram the whole time. So now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So now this is the first time that God speaks to Abraham and tells him that he is going to be this amazing person. That there's some amazing stuff going to flow from his loins. So now switch over to chapter 13, and starting in verse 14. So from what we just read to this point, now there's things going on. Abram moves. And now the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, and eastward, and westward. For the land which you see, I will give it to your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and its breadth, and I will give it to you. And Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So, north, south, east, and west. What does that encompass? Everywhere. Because, as we know, if we go north and south, eventually you'll be turning north or south. But if you're facing eastward, you'll always be facing east. That's when we know that when we talk about in prophecy of Christ, he will take what knows the distance from the east from the west. It's infinite. If you're always pointing eastward, you'll always be going east. Where if you're walking northward, eventually you will be walking southward. So he gives this promise to Abram that basically the entire planet, the world, will be given to his descendants. And his descendants will be numbered like the dust of the earth. And that word dust shows up in Genesis chapter 2, when man is formed out of the dust of the earth. So he will have an earthly, natural descendant. Okay? His seed. And that word descendants is actually better translated as seed. So his seed will be numbered as the dust of the earth. And then there's a war that breaks out, and an amazing character jumps on the scene in verse 17. And from 17 to the end of the chapter, this guy Melchizedek comes on the scene. And I know Austin is taught here on Melchizedek. So this high priest shows up. Let's just read it. So then after the return from the defeat of Chaldemor and the kings, where were they? In 17 of 14. The king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheba, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Was there another priest that you know of that brought forth bread and wine?
Jesus.
Amen. So, in accordance with this order, Christ brings out bread and wine the same way this Melchizedek does. And now he was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed him. Blessed be Abram, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered the enemies into your hands. And pretty much that's the story of Melchizedek. Until you get to the book of Hebrews, and there's a whole lot about that, which we will not go into today. So, just want to go to the chronological order of events here in Abram's life. So, he's given this promise that his seed will be like the descendant, his seed will be like the dust of the earth, which will basically take over the whole world. Melchizedek comes on the scene and blesses Abram. And now in chapter 15, he gets promised a son. And then, you guys are all familiar with the story of Sarai and Hagar? Okay. So Sarai is Abram's wife, and she's getting old. She's 97 at this point, 98 at this point, and God promises that he will have a child. And clearly, they fall out. They do not believe that Sarai was the woman that could do it. So Sarai gives her maidservant, Hagar, and then Abram marries, gives her as a wife, comes into her, and then she gives birth to a child named Ishmael. Okay. So we have so Abram into Hagar and has Ishmael. That's why you know that I cannot spell, for those who know me. So you're just going to have to do it. Unless somebody else wants to notate that. So Abram, Hagar, Ishmael. And the first promise is of dust. Okay, so the fulfillment of this dust is in Ishmael. Question? Okay. Cool? Okay. So, now, in chapter 15, another promise is given. Starting in verse 5. Actually, we're going to go in verse 4. Then behold, the word of the Lord came saying, this man, following out Ishmael, will not be your heir, but the one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, now look towards the heavens and count the stars. If you're able to count them, he said, so your descendants shall be. And he believed the Lord and reckoned to him his righteousness. Chapter 16, Ishmael. And then in 18, well, let me not skip over this. Chapter 17. Can somebody read from verse 1 through verse 5?
Now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations.
So now his name is changed. His identity is changed. We have first and second. Then throughout the next chapter, through this chapter, Sarai's name is changed to Sarah. They laugh when God says she laughs when God says you're going to have a child. And then in verse 19, but God said, no, but Sarah, your wife. Sorry.
Sarah.
Yeah. Actually, you know what, George? Why don't you read from 15 through 22?
Then God said to Abraham,
What chapter are we on?
we're
So
on
17.
17:50. Then God said to Abraham, as far as Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she will be the mother of nations. Kings, peoples will come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. But God said, no, but Sarah your wife will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard your, behold, I will bless him, and will make him faithful, fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. When he finished talking with him, God went up to Abraham. Stop at 22.
Yeah, that's good. So now the promise of Isaac is given to Sarah. Sarai's name is changed to Sarah. The promise of Isaac is given. And then, Bible geeks, what happens? What's the next part of the story? Isaac is born, and then what? God says, this son, I want you to take him up to the mountain, and you're going to sacrifice him. Then what happens? What's that? Takes him up the mountain.
Yeah.
So chapter 21.
And God divides
Okay. So let's go read some of that. So in chapter 21, Isaac is born, and then Sarah turns against Hagar, and Hagar flees. And she's running away, and then an angel of the Lord comes to Hagar and says, go back, she'll treat you favorably, and I will bless Ishmael. I will make him a nation of many. And chapter 22 is when Isaac is going to be offered up. So let's go read through that. So let's start in verse 6 as we started the story. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took his hand, the fire and knife. And the two of them walked together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold the fire and the wood. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. So Isaac is unaware that he is the lamb. And he came to the place in which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac and laid him on an altar on top of the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am. Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him for a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham called the name of this place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it will be provided. So this is an amazing drama that ensues. This, 13. So Isaac is about to be slain, and God provides a scapegoat. Now, clearly, this points to Yeshua. This points to Christ. Isaac, his only son, even though he had another one, his only true son, who happened to be his second son, according to the promise, not according to the flesh, but according to the promise, was going to be offered up. And when he raises his knife, he says, stop. Now I know your heart is pure. And look, behold, there is a ram caught in the bush. And he offers up this ram, pointing to the Christ who would take that place. And then once this takes place, this is when it gets interesting. So then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, I indeed will greatly bless you, and I will multiply your seed as the stars in the heaven and the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. So we have two times where it's mentioned of stars, one time dust, one time sand.
Steve, you're writing that. You're going to repeat that, what you just said, right?
The first promise, right, when it was to Abram, was that your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. Okay? And he comes into Hagar and has a child of flesh. And his inheritance is the entire earth. And then his faith is reckoned to him as righteousness. He believes God. Sarai is changed to Sarah. Abram is changed to Abraham. And now he has his first only son according to the promise. And God says, I want you to sacrifice him. And takes him up the mount. And instead of sacrificing his son, God replaces that offering with an offering of a ram according to his desire. And his name is Isaac. And now, since that took place, he says, your descendants will be like the stars in the heaven and the sand that is like the seashore. Why is these dust, sand, stars so important? That's a real question.
Because dust of the earth, sand, or stars from the heaven.
Yeah. And anybody want to chime in on some of what this potentially can mean?
Well, dust is dry. Sand is usually near the water. And stars reflect light.
Reflect?
Well, actually, stars, the moon reflects it. Stars have their own light.
They're like the stars.
Body, soul, spirit.
And one's spiritual and one's earthly.
Body, out of the dust, he has formed man from the dust of the earth. This promise to Ishmael is the promise of the body that has inheritances this entire earth. But then when we come into the promise, birth from a child that was going to be the sacrifice but was replaced by a scapegoat, we then, by faith, become the sand in the seashore. Have you heard it said in the book of Revelation, the beast comes up out of the sea? And John says, well, what is this? What am I seeing? And the angel says, the waters that you saw is nations and multitudes, tribes and tongues. So the sea is the world. And this beast will come up out of the world. So if the sea, as far as the angel tells John in the book of Revelations, is nations, multitudes, tribes, and tongues, then we should juxtapose that exegesis of sea everywhere there's sea mentioned. Either it's not true, or we shouldn't use it. So, if it is true that the sea is nations, multitudes, tribes, and tongues, then the sand, which is by the seashore, is those who have come up out of the sea and now are on dry land. Behold, cast your net on the other side, for I will make you fishers of men. Christ walking on the sea, sitting on a boat, preaching to those on dry land, sending Peter to get a coin out of a fish's mouth. So, sand on the seashore is now those who have been grafted into Abraham, according to the promise. We now come up out of the sea. We are no longer the dust. We are now sand on the seashore. And this is the soul, the resemblance of our soul. So this star concept, why sand and stars after the sacrifice of Isaac? So, duly noted, someone said that stars are like suns. So, all things work together for the good, for those who love God and called according to his purpose, so that he would become the firstborn among many brethren, so that we would be conformed to the image of his Son. That conforming is becoming a son, having the same identity of the Son. The sun that governs the day now is the type and the shadow of Christ. When we put on that identity, we become a star in heaven, having the same substance, having light within ourselves, not just a reflection of it, but the substance of that light.
So Steve, we are sand first and then stars?
Yes,
That's the progression you're suggesting. Yeah, sure, okay.
yes. You must be born again, born of water, and born of spirit. That is the progression of faith. So, we have this story now. We just paraphrased through months of study in this story of Abraham. And now Isaac has some children. Somebody want to tell me the story of Isaac? Brother Austin?
Sure. Isaac, obviously the son of promise. He lives in Abraham's household. Comes time for him to be married, and Abraham wants him to have a wife from the land where he came from. So Abraham sends his servant Eliezer back to his homeland.